So my game has a lot of problems. Artistic problems, technical problems, and design problems, which for the most part I've been able to kick down the road and avoid. Some of these problems I can continue to avoid, others require fixing now because they are just holding up development. The biggest problem at the moment is that there's not a large enough difference between bases and ships. At the moment, a base is essentially a ship that can't move, and why would you build a base when you can just have a base that moves? One change that would make ships and bases more cohesive would be to separate the resource economy into cargo and items. Doing this would allow me to control what sort of items can be stored on a ship in large quantities. Another change would be to make ships smaller and more functional. Instead of designing larger ships with lots of rooms to decorate, customize, and store items in, I could design ships that are tailored to a specific function. Ships could place on a sort of spectrum between cargo hauler, fighter, and explorer, giving them certain strengths and weaknesses. Needless to say, 3D art is not my strong point. However, after the first two shaky attempts, the third one looks like it might just do the trick. It's quite small and tanky, with 4 placeholder guns at the front. I've blocked out the interior to have a very small cargo bay, a decently sized room where the player could place a few things, and then a cockpit. This ship will act as my test ship for implementing the main ship systems. Now that ships have a clear path forward, I can move on to a different issue. Currently, the terrain workflow involves procedurally generating a Unity terrain using sliders, fields, and curves. While there is nothing wrong with procedurally generated terrain, the procedural space game already exists, and part of my game's design was to have more handcrafted environments. Playing around with values until I get something that looks interesting is not a great way to design levels. I have an idea to create a tool that lets me generate different terrain types based on a biome map, allowing me to create the planets in broad strokes. I could mask out an area with a specific color, and that would correspond to a biome and a set of parameters for the procedural generator. After cannibalizing the terrain generator and planet editor, I have a tool that lets me set the number of chunks the planet should have, and generate a height map based on a low-res biome map texture. Each pixel represents a point on the terrain, and the color determines how it should generate. When I change the size of the planet, I also have the option to either rescale the biome map, or to just extend the map with the first biome. Unfortunately, even though most of this stuff is running on the GPU in a compute shader, it's still quite slow. The terrain is also very blocky, and doesn't blend very well. Okay, so the tool works a little differently now. Instead of just using the low-res biome map texture to determine what generates, it uses 2 larger textures. Each color in the low-res biome map texture gets separated out into its own channel across the 2 larger textures and then is upscaled. I've also added this biome blend parameter that controls the radius of a box blur function that blurs each channel across the 2 textures. The end result gets rid of the very blocky outline of each biome. There are still other artifacts that need to be fixed, like I'm not sure what's causing these weird speckly lines to appear, but I'm sure I'll figure it out. I still have no clue what was causing those weird lines to appear, but I managed to make them go away by adding a smoothness parameter that runs the box blur function over the entire height map. During my troubleshooting though, I did discover some other problems, mainly with Unity's default terrain system. I was operating under the assumption that the terrains were more performant than meshes, but apparently this is not the case. I also discovered that the biggest bottleneck in my tool is setting the heights of each terrain object. This means that the next iteration of this tool and of the wider planet system will not use any Unity terrains and will use static meshes. I'd also like to do away with the low-res biome map texture and just paint each biome in their own channel in Editor. But that's all for another day though, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.